Most new event ideas suck. They're awful. The worst is two blind. Since many of the events people suggest are based off existing events, slight variations that we sort of have of some, but anyway. They one look solves. You don't use a blind method to solve 2x2 the quickest, you one look. Because that's, So basically, two blind would be 2x2 rankings at the time, a couple seconds added, I guess, for one looking. So yeah, that's a terrible event. So if you add two blind, remove 2x2. Some of the other events people suggest are similar ones that are based loosely off WCA events. I sort of refer to them myself as, think of them as WCA plus. So like 8x8 and 9x9. People already complain these two events are very similar and not distinct enough from 5x5, but yeah, they are pretty distinct from 5x5 when it comes to solving centres. Other than that, yeah, they are pretty similar. But yeah. 8x8 and 9x9 also take longer. These are the longest events that aren't blind events. So yeah, adding events that are very similar even longer because, the WCA has some criteria they want to follow, one of which is uniqueness and practicality. And then there's a scrambling issue, but then these aren't random states, so yeah. And then that leads to one-handed events, like one-handed whatever, 4x4, 5x5, whatever puzzle. It's just, we already have OH. Do we really need another OH event? I mean, OH is, kind of, I don't know, it exists. I think there's only really need for one. I mean, if you want to practice them unofficially, that's fine. Then there's also, like, larger order or lower order puzzles of the side events, such as Megaminx and Pyraminx. So Kilominx, there's not really much to Kilominx, because it's just kind of a 2x2 and Megaminx merged, And the same goes for Giga and, like, whatever Terra. It's just a 5x5 and that together, and plus a Gigaminx, like, what's the UWI I've seen is like 6.5 minutes. Obviously, if it was ever made official, that would come down a lot, but that's a lot slower. Like, yeah, that's a pretty long event, especially for a sighted one. And then, of course, as I said before, Master Pyraminx, I don't really know, I haven't sold it much. I mean, it probably would get quite quick and kind of trivial. I don't really have a strong opinion either way. I mean, there's the whole question of why add events, but this is just discussing the suggestions, not whether or not we should actually add them. And then there's 3x3 shape mods, such as these. I don't know, I mean, we already have one-handed and blind and multi-blind. Like, there's already 4 events involving 3x3s. Do we really need more? I mean, this is the only distinguishing thing from, like, this is, like, the shapes of the pieces is how we recognise rather than the, there's the whole blind with feeling the types of pieces, but, yeah, that's something new. That'd probably take a while, but I don't know. And then, yeah, there's a similar story of these. I mean, these are slightly different from 3x3 because this is an edge and it doesn't have orientation, so it can be flipped, meaning you have, like, effectively a parity, but it's just, and the centers have orientation. I mean, that's just small distinguishing factors. You just use CFOP. Your cross is a little different because of this, and you have to learn how to recognise your last layer algs, but that's it. And with this, it's kind of the same thing, Doesn't add anything new. That's the thing. I mean, popularity is the other thing to consider, but nothing unofficial is that popular. Then there's stuff like cuboids. I mean, I don't know much about cuboids. I mean, I barely solved, like, this one. It's awful because it's Cube for You. It came out in, like, 2009? Oh, look, I somehow popped just the corner out. But yeah, I think this does actually have some similarities to Square 1, I think, because of, like, the R2 turning. It's like... But also, I think it's like, which cuboids do you add? The problem is there's so many of them. I think there is some distinctions with the different types. I mean, of course, this is one that doesn't shapeshift because it's it's 3x3 by 4, so this is odd, so it doesn't shapeshift. And the ones that shapeshift, like 3x3 by 5, you solve like a 3x3, and then it's just, I think, higher order reduction type stuff. Because this is like solving a 3x3 by 2, and then another one. I think like the 3x5 by 7 apparently has a unique parity to it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about cuboids. I mean, it is a new category, but I think a lot of the cuboids are all very similar to each other. It's like, well, which ones do you add? There's just that logistical thing of, there's a lot. Like, up to 7 by 7, I mean, we only have 6 puzzles that are n by n by n. But then you got your n by n by m and like your n by m by o's. Because you've got the 3 by 4 by 5 sort of thing, which only shapeshifts on one axis rather than two. And then, of course, as I said before, the one that shapeshifts on 3, the 3 by 4 by 3 by 5 by 7 or whatever. It's just a very, very large sort of, I guess, untapped area. I mean, I don't know much how they are to solve, obviously, but yeah, it's like there's a lot you could have there. Yeah. Next thing I've got written down is relays. I don't know. I think there's any need for relays. I mean, relays can be fun. Your 2 through 5 relays, and then like 2 through 7. But the thing is that it's just solving a bunch of puzzles in a row. I think relays type stuff that could be funner is more things kind of like the Nations Cup. I think it's slightly better to watch in some ways, rather than one person solving a bunch of puzzles. Like, this is easy to implement on the regulations. Inspection time's a bit, you only get 15 seconds for everything as opposed to one each, but yeah, it's just like, the people that will be good at this are the people that are good at these events. So Max Park, Felix to some extent, like, the rankings don't look different, especially people good at those events, since being good at 7 means you're decent at all these events down here. And then 2x2 is such an insignificant amount of time compared to the rest. It's like, yeah. Now, there are a few more events to cover. I've got a couple other non-WCA puzzles that I haven't covered yet. That I've got on the list. So, Gear Cube. This is the last one I actually own. Gear Cube is something kind of new, but it is quite simple, because it's just like, it's only half turns available, at least on the standard Gear Cube. Like so, let's see if I remember to solve it. And I did sort of figure out myself. So yeah, you only got half turns. The method for this basically sort of involves, okay, so we solve that, and then it's got such a confusing colour scheme. What is it? Purple opposite yellow, red opposite blue, green opposite orange. Some knockoff. It's not the efforts. Oh, what have I done? Yeah, so basically you solve the corners, but since it's half turns, that's easy, and then you just work on the edges. It's just like, yeah. Now to talk about, oh yeah, I didn't really cover mirror blocks. Oh no, I did in the shape mods, but yeah, there's also some regulation questions with this about the thickness of the layers and what's allowed or what not. But that's just some logistic stuff. Ivy Cube. So Ivy Cube is a cubic transformation of the pyraminx, which means the edges become centres, and the tips go away, and the corners just turn the same. Well, there are corners, but only 4 corners turn, not 8. Yeah. So it basically means that this is considered solved on an Ivy Cube, the equivalent combination without EO. This means that the number of combinations is very low. It's like 29,000 odd combinations. I'm going to put up God's number breakdown because God's number is 8. It's just not practical to hold because of the simplicity of the puzzle. Like, it is such a simple twisty puzzle compared to like even this. Like, 29,000 combinations is such a low number. It's just, no, 29,000 is a fairly big number in terms of scrambles on a twisty puzzle. It just isn't, because if you think about this being held, you have to have at least 2 moves, and for all WC events. I know for the simple puzzles they add more, like 4, 6, and 7. But then on Ivy Cube, if you had like a similar move count cap, most of the scrambles are gone. And even if you were to just do 2 moves, or have no restrictions, you get repeat duplicate scrambles. They could come up with the same average. Like, you're more likely to get a last layer skip. Then, well, you're slightly more likely, you could get a last layer skip in a solve, any single solve. I don't know about statistics. 100 solves, 100 sort of averages, rounds, there's a high chance of a duplicate coming up. God's number's 8, it's too simple. I don't know the remix, that's God's number is 19, I believe. It's simple, the way you solve it, it doesn't take much. It's just like you sort of solve the corners just twist in their spot, and only the edges really move around, and I don't think they have any sort of orientation. It's just, yeah. It's a fairly simple, easy puzzle to solve, and I think we don't need another easy puzzle if we're going to add anything new at all. I think a new puzzle seems the best bet, and it needs to be sufficiently complicated that the world record isn't going to be hugely trivial. There's already 3 simple puzzles in the WCA. We don't need more. Then I think Pyramid Geo, some people suggest Pyramid God's number is 4. Snake is... I don't know, I don't think anyone cares about Snake. You just put that into a ball. I had that years ago. When I first started cubing, and it's just like, yeah, no, that's just like having magic all over again. And then there's stuff like Curvy Copter and Edge Turner. Yeah, an Edge Turner is something unique. The WCA only has corner turners and face turners. I mean, the Pyraminx is technically both. Yeah. Like, you might think of it more as a corner turner because you tend to just turn the tips, but shift your perspective, that's a face turner. Just, you know, the corners are opposite the face, so that's why that happens. But yeah, now the last one I want to discuss is Team Blind. Now, I've got a lot more to say about Team Blind, since this is by far perhaps the most popular event to be added. By far. I think this is the one people want the most. It's a team event, which definitely is something novel. The scrambling is no issue, and it's just, I think there's so many logistical issues that could have issues with this. Like, it can be fun to do, but I think officially I sort of started thinking a bit more. One thing that really made me think, I don't know about this, is how will these events change when they're made official? Like, what will be some developments we haven't thought of? Because Scube. When Scube was added, I think people didn't expect it to get as fast as it did as fast. Because, I don't know, it progressed pretty fast if we look at the world records. It's like, basically the basic method, I think, made in 2010 before it was official was, you know, there's the old make a face, and then there was one that was actually put the corner on top. What am I doing? I need to actually look not through this. And then there was one where it involved, I think, solving this, and then doing last 5 centers. You just solve the corners on top with no regard. Of course, Sarah's Advanced took a more direct approach to doing last layer, put the center on top, then solve, sort of thing, depending on intermediate, advanced, or whatever. But yeah. So Scube basically became the same as 2x2. Solve a layer, solve the cube. I mean, I did that wrong because I wasn't really looking, but yeah. So looking back at what happened to Scube when it was added, we've got to think what would happen with Team Blind. Now, one thing that seems obvious is I think the calling would become standardized. So obviously there's the skill of being able to read out what the cross solution is. So in this case, we'll be like, oh, it's D prime L U R2, and then obviously the difference is some people will be able to call out the full cross plus 1 or cross or whatever. And then I think with things like common triggers, like that will have a word, that would have a word, so like R prime UR, you know, all those short 3-move triggers word. Of course, sexy move does. And then of course, you know, I just think eventually it would just become like, you call out the moves of the cross, and then you just say like 4 words to cover F2L, and then another 2 to cover like OL, KL. Obviously, the skill set of certain competitors might mean they can use much larger ALG sets and might do multi-slotting type stuff, like things like that would perhaps make it distinct. But I think that the most basic system that would be created, a simple one to cover basic CFOP, would be the most common, because let's face it, most cubers never bother learning much advanced things. There's heaps of cubers that never bother learning OLL. So you'd even get probably calls for like 2-look OLL that, you know, they'd be easy. You'd be like, I don't know, they'd be like line, L and dot, you know. You say line, L, dot. Tell them like U, line, and then whatever T, U, L, pi, you know, those whatever words people use for the sets of CLL, ZBLL, whatever, ZBLL. Yeah. And then the PLL is easy. It's just, I don't know how interesting that would be for you to do. It's just that that is something to think about. I mean, it's so hard to predict what would actually happen. The unforeseen developments, I mean, that may make it less interesting, because I think that wouldn't be very interesting. Then there are the logistical issues, such as the format. What format do we hold? How do you display the results? I mean, these are things that someone could come up with a solution for to help it make official. But yeah, and then there's the issue of people talking to each other in comp, because as I said, the calling system is going to be standard if this is made official. There will be a standard calling system that basically everybody uses. Everyone uses. That'll be what happens. I mean, there may be a beginner's version and a more intermediate version and an advanced one, such as maybe two fast people that get together would work a lot harder, and then, which also leads to the question of how do we pick our teams? Do the people pick them beforehand? Like, that seems fair, but then there's also, what if someone wants to do it that's a bit of a beginner and, they don't have anyone to go with? Could you do a random draw? I mean, that's unfair. And then there's the question of, I'd say you have to have people going from the same country. You can't have two different countries, because then the NRs would get all, fucked up. Because how do you display an NR when one person's from, like, Australia and the other one's from, like, I don't know, the US or something? It's just, or two European countries. I mean, that could work for a continental record, but for national it can't. So I'd say you have to have it from the same country, which, makes it worse for people from smaller countries to find teammates. It's just, I don't know, it's difficult. It's the logistics that make this one bad, but then another point I'm suddenly thought of is, how will this event develop? What will it look like in a few years? It's just like, that's the big one, actually, after the logistics. I mean, the format, you could have the people switch roles. Like, there's one possible one where it's like, they switch roles, and then you add the time where they have switched roles together and then do a mean of 3 or something. Or you just do a mean of 3, I guess. Let them choose the roles or whatever, but I'd say they'd have to stay fixed. And then, of course, people could be in different teams, so that would get the results, because you'd have to list them with the team, I guess. You put the two names together. Yeah. Actually, displaying the results might not be as hard as some people say. You just put the names together in order, alphabetical order, I guess. If you want to maybe change the order based on what roles they have, like on the left you put the caller and on the right the solver. It's just you have to put two names. But it's just, it's starting to get a bit rambly, but yeah, it's just the logistics. People, calling out, that's cheating. You're not allowed to talk about scrambles. That's the big issue. Do we change it so it's just sort of touch-based or something? Like you pinch someone's, or tap them. Silent team blind. Then again, there'll be a completely standardised system that comes out, and I think that will make it a lot more boring, to be honest, in some ways. Because it's kind of like, you switch the caller and the solvers and mix up the teams, and everyone that uses it, they basically will be using the same system for the most part. Suddenly it's just like, they'll be at the lower end, I'll be at the high end, the system will be based off it, but then it'll be more advanced, like more shorthands, there'll be slightly more, because of course, like, two fast people know ZBLL, but then, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what you come up with that. Might mean we get proper names for all the OLLs and stuff that people start referring to them by. But yeah, because that's the thing, like, people use different algs, it'd just be easier to call out what algs there are. I don't know. This really is starting to turn into a real ramble, so I need to just stop. But the final point is it's important to consider with all events, what will they be like after a couple years, when they've been made official. Of course, hardware will improve because the Q companies will release them, but hardware, who cares? The hardware is not important in this state. It's what will the event look like. Skewb within a couple years, basically, by 2015, 2014, it's no different to today in terms of how people do it, I reckon. I mean, I wasn't really following it super carefully, but the methods are the same. I mean, obviously algs get optimized and developed and things, but it's still solve face, solve layer. It's just the layer, instead of using Cirrus Advanced, started optimizing the algs more and more to have proper algs. And some people started one looking. So, yeah. With Team Blind, there'll be a standardized calling system. It's up to you to make up your mind on whether or not you think that's good or bad for the event, because it's an inevitability. It's just because most cubers tend to be, slow or whatever, or younger. I think that they'll all definitely use the same system. Faster people might have slight more optimizations, but yeah, there'll be a standard calling system. You need to figure out what the format is, and there's a lot of logistics in order to make this official. Then there's the issue of, what if someone doesn't have anyone that wants to compete with them? They miss out, which I guess goes against the spirit of the WCA with the more fun, more competitions in other areas. I mean, if you are able to compete in it easily, someone's willing to do it with you, then yeah, it is fun. I mean, Might not just be because no one likes you or just thinks you're really bad. Either they just think you're poor, or there's an odd number of people that want to work on it. It's just like everyone else is already paired up and there's no one else. Then there's how do people register for it? I don't know. It's just the logistics is what limits that. But I'm also now thinking a little bit about it. I go, oh, what happens with when it's made official?